I have my husband with me today. We're preparing for upcoming Father's Day, but this little discussion, this little interview is with one of my favorite fathers.
One of?
My favorite father. But it's titled Fatherless on Father's Day. And just think that my husband has a really neat story and how he grew up without a father, and wanted him to share a little bit about that. So,
All right. You want me to start from the beginning?
yes, talk about how you grew up.
All right. Well, my father left. Well, first of all, I'm the youngest of six. There are four boys and two girls, and I'm the youngest. So I always laugh and say I have a brother and a sister who could be my mother and father.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a brother who's 21 years older than I am and a sister who's 20 years older than I am. So my mother spread out six children over a long period of time. But I'm the youngest, and my father left when I was a year and a half, 18 months old. So I have no memory whatsoever. I'm sure I never did. Never met him after 18 months. If he walked up right now, I would have no idea what he looks like. I've probably only seen a handful of pictures over the years. So fatherless from pretty much the very beginning.
So some of your other siblings had some memory of him, but you have no memory of him.
Right, that's correct. I have my brother who's the closest to me, 4 years older. He had a little bit of a memory, and he really struggled with wanting to go find him as a high school kid. My brother had a lot of, was more rambunctious and dropped out of school, that kind of stuff, and a lot of that turmoil part of his life. He really wanted to go find him. Then I have a sister who's almost 8 years older than I am, and she has more strong memories, but they're as a child. You can tell her memories are colored by an 8-year-old child.
So what did that do to your family dynamics and your financial situation growing up? Not having a father, not having any stability.
In some ways, my mom was very, very independent. And she never wanted to be, well, I'll say it like this. Well, we were very, very poor. My mom had a 12th grade education, graduated from high school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and then followed my father up here years later to Mississippi. I was born and raised here, but half my family was born and raised in Baton Rouge, or born in Baton Rouge, the other half up here. And but when she only had a high school education, and so when he walked out of the door, she had nothing. She had no money, no nothing, and a high school education. And she began working just where she could, things ranging from a receptionist at the old Hines General Hospital answering phones to, at one point, she was away from me so long, and she wanted to remedy that she drove a school bus for a short period of time, and I would ride with her. This was before I was in school. I would sit in the front of the bus while she picked up kids, and she did that for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 months, just because I was always being taken to a daycare kind of thing, and it was driving her crazy.
So when you talk about growing up poor, what are some examples of memories of that growing up?
Define poor? Yeah, that could be defined very. When my mom would get behind on electricity bills and things like that, we would go long periods of time with no electricity. We'd go long periods of time with no electricity or no water. There was one point, a little bit later in life, where my sister had gone into the military, and because of some long distance phone calls, international phone calls and that kind of thing, we went without a phone for 2 or 3 years. And this was back before cell phones and everything. If you didn't have a phone, you had no way of reaching anybody. So we were poor. I mean, my mother could barely make a small house note that was set up on our house in South Jackson in I think she bought that house in like 67 or 68. So the house note wasn't huge, but it was still a struggle to make that.
And what kind of jobs did you do growing up? What were your first jobs?
My first jobs, my first official job, where it was a real job where you had taxes taken out and all that, was caramel corn. The old caramel corns in the Metro Center, Jackson Mall, Metro Center, Mr. McKenzie owned those, and he happened to be a member of our church. We grew up at Hillcrest Baptist Church. He was a member, and so he would hire the high school kids in his shops. And so I had to have special permission because I went to him. I think I can't remember exactly how it worked out, but I was ready to work, and you had to be 16 years old, or you had to have some sort of special permission. So I think at 14 and a half, something like that, I got that permission, and I worked for him early.
And what did you do with your money? Was it spending
And
money?
that was just, the caramel corn was just for a while. I also worked in a body shop. I worked in one of my more interesting jobs was a medical supply. My mother worked at a medical supply company, so I got on in the warehouse as a 16-year-old and would drive forklifts during the summer. I worked the night shift, so I'd go in at like, I don't know, 5 or 6 in the afternoon and get off at 8 or 9 the next morning, something like that, and would drive a forklift and pick orders. And that was actually a lot of fun. I just did that, of course, over the summer when I was out of school. But anyway, jobs like that.
So
What I do with my money? Well, I help my mom pay bills. we pay
did she
bills.
ask you to do that?
No, my mom never did. It's just
Why did you do that then?
because I saw the struggle. I mean, I couldn't go to work and then, I don't know, what else would you do?
So you were a teenager paying bills with your money.
Yes.
And talk about how you came to know the Lord. How did you come to salvation, and how did that happen? How did God guide you that way?
Yeah, I was one of those, you hear about that all the time. He was someone who grew up in the church. My dad may have left, but Mom very quickly connected to primarily Hillcrest Baptist Church. And we grew up in South Jackson, close to Tennis Center South, McDowell Road, that area. And we went to Hillcrest, and just from day one, I was there. And then I was in 5th grade, which I started school at 5 years old, so so I was around 10 years old. I was around 10 years old, and I was at church one Sunday, and most of the time Mom would take us to church. But for some reason, my memory is, and I have no idea why, but Mom wasn't there. I think she was sick or something. I don't even know how I got to church that day. Again, we went to church every Sunday, and usually Mom would take us, but for this Sunday, she didn't. And again, I don't even know how I got there. But I was in the balcony, and Brother Maurice Clayton, just incredible pastor, had more of the Bible memorized than I could ever imagine. It was amazing. He would just come up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scriptures all memorized. Amazing his command of the Bible. I remember that about him. Anyway, he was there that Sunday morning, and for whatever reason, I sat in the balcony, probably because my mother wasn't there, so I could go hide out in the balcony. It's usually kids like sit in the balcony, so we did. And I just remember the message was an evangelical message about what Jesus did for you. And for whatever, on that day, I recognized that it was that day that I had to turn my life over to him. So I remember holding on to the front of the pew, leaving that balcony, and that took forever because you had to come up the balcony, walk down, and walk all the way down to the front of the church. But that's what I did, and I gave my heart to Christ. And I would say it was a culmination of just years of being in the church, but on that day, I shifted my believing loyalty, which we teach a lot about believing loyalty. On that day, I made it clear where my loyalty would be for the rest of my life.
And then what about discipleship? How did being a Christian and being in the church help you to be discipled, especially being fatherless?
Discipleship was all about the church. It was never prior to youth group time. So we're talking 5th grade, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. It was just godly men primarily. Godly men in our church who would be my Sunday school teacher, whether it was the Victor Dormans and the Trussels of the world, and the Andy Pickens of the world. It was men that I look back who you know how that works. As a child, you don't know this, but you know how it works. Somebody at the church says, "We need a Sunday school teacher." And that person probably was like, "Oh, not again. I don't know if I can do this." And they drag them in there. But those men in that Sunday school environment, they taught you how to live a Christian life, and they gave you a male example to look at. And then when it came time for the youth group, Hillcrest hired Charles Welch, and we were incredible. First of all, an incredible Bible teacher, an incredible youth minister, and a youth minister who always saw youth as his primary ministry, meaning he wasn't there to work for a few years until he got a senior pastor job somewhere. He was there through our entire 12 years. I mean, our whole 6 years, all the way from 7th grade through 12th. So I had the same youth pastor. So there were hundreds of late nights at campouts, late nights at trips, him bringing me home because I never had a car or anything. So he'd have to bring me home after dropping off all the other kids after some church event, and us sitting outside my home talking in the van for hours when he should be home with his wife and kids probably. But that was discipleship. Discipleship was in the church with those kind of people.
And what about, that was, you went to Wingfield, and what about college? How did you went to Millsaps College. How did you decide Millsaps, and how did you get into Millsaps?
That's all.
And you were the first kid in the whole family, the first one in the whole family to go to college.
Yeah. And that's
So
all.
how did that happen?
I look back at this, I really don't know. Yes, I was the youngest of 6, as I said. My mom did not go to college. None of my siblings had at that time either. And so I was the only one, and I had a physics teacher, Mr. Walker, at People's Junior High. And in public schools at that time, or at least my experience was, you had very few male teachers, and the few you did have, they were generally very, very old and had been in the system forever. But he was a younger, just a neat guy.
Was he at Peoples and Wingfield?
No, I believe just Wingfield. I don't think he was at Peoples.
Okay, you said Peoples.
Yeah, I say Peoples, I meant Wingfield High School. And anyway, just a neat guy, and he was a graduate of Millsaps. And so just throughout his physics classes, and I probably took multiple classes for him just because I wanted to be in his classroom. And but so he would tell stories about Millsaps, and he would always tell us it was a difficult school, the hardest school to get into. You know, he was bragging about his own school. And then all I thought was, well, if it's the hardest and it's the best, that's where I want to go. And so I never applied anywhere. I took the ACT one time, and then I applied to Millsaps. I have no idea what I would have done had I not been accepted. I didn't apply anywhere else. I never sent an application, anything else. I just did it.
So when you filled out that application, what did you find out you had to have?
Well, I found out that that you had a federal aid form. They used to call it, now it's a different name, but FAF.
Because you knew you had to have
Had
financial
to have
aid.
financial aid. My mom had no money. And so I'm figuring out all this stuff. We didn't really, well, I'm sure we had a counselor at the school, but you know, I'm figuring out where all this stuff's coming from. And I finally found the form. I think you had to go to a post office at some point to get that form. You did back then, because you couldn't just get on the internet. The internet wasn't there
Right.
yet. So I think I found the form, and I figure out on the form that you have to have 2 years of tax returns. Well, I found out, of course, my mom, she didn't make any money. She hadn't filed taxes in years. I mean, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And the only way I could fill out my form, and you had to fill that form out before you could even put in an application to Millsaps. So the only way to do that was I had to figure out a way for my mom to file back taxes. And so I just went to work. And again, no internet, you couldn't search anything. So I'm going to the library. Back then, the primary place you would find information is libraries and tax forms. If it was tax season, you would go there to get your extra tax forms, your 1099s, your various forms. They would distribute them by putting them at libraries.
So this is a 17-year-old
16 or 17, yeah.
Wingfield student who is going downtown to the tax.
Oh yeah, what I did is I went to the library, found all the forms, and got all the instructions I could get, and tried to teach myself as best I could how to restate prior year's taxes on the 1040 form. First I had to go dig through all my mom's stuff and find any information I could find. Old W-2 forms, old income, anything. She just had receipts stuffed in drawers. I did that. But what happened is I got as much of it done as I could and just wasn't sure. So I bought, to this day it's in the house, I bought a little briefcase looking plastic sort of briefcase, and put all the files in there, and I went down to the federal building in downtown Jackson, the IRS office. And this little 16-year-old kid with his bucket, basically like a bucket in his hand, I walked in, I just told the lady at the front desk at the head of the IRS there, the IRS office, and told him who I was, and she looked at me in the funniest look, almost laughed at me, and she found me somebody and drug me to their office. And that person helped me finish those forms. I restated 4 years of her taxes and got back my mother $3,000 or $4,000. She was due money back. She had just never filed for it.
Which was probably a windfall.
That was a windfall for my mom, yeah. And I was accepted.
And you were accepted. Is that why you majored in accounting?
That was that was probably a big thing that got me interested in accounting.
And you're
At that point, I didn't even know what accounting was.
you're a
but
CPA, so you majored in accounting, but you didn't really know what you wanted to do. But you had just restated 4 years of taxes, so
Yep.
you thought maybe I'll do this.
Yep, yep. The other
But you
thing that
never
got me-
did do taxes.
No, I went into the audit side. I quickly
Yeah.
realized I don't want to do these taxes all the time.
Right. So why did you major in accounting at Millsap?
Yeah, at Millsaps, I was majoring in political science and accounting, or business administration and political science. And I loved Professor Badler, just a great old school, what they would call an old school liberal, not what we would call a liberal today. Anyway, just a wonderful, wonderful man. Loved him. And he called me in his office one day. He says, and he and I had some of the greatest debates because we differed politically. He was just a wonderful man. But anyway, he called me in his office and he says, and he had this kind of English sort of accent, and he would tell me, he was saying, you need to major in political science. And I smiled, and I told him how much I loved it, how much I loved his classes, but that I couldn't. That I could not afford to go to law school because I had to get out and make money. I couldn't just continue on in school. And that's generally where the political science degree would lead, is go to law school. I said, I can't. I've got to go make money. So I said, I'm going to major in accounting, become a CPA, but I'm going to minor in political science. So I stayed in his classes and minored in political science. But
Wow. So you graduated and got a big six accounting job and a big check as a right out of college, and you
Some big pen.
started chipping away, doing spreadsheets and timetables of helping pay down your mom's debt.
Yes,
And
she had many, many years of old lots. I got a copy of her credit report that had all this stuff on it. And I just, everybody would have said file bankruptcy. She has nothing. I don't believe. I know you're not going to file bankruptcy. These are things she owed. And so we didn't. I didn't file bankruptcy or anything. I just took a big lot. Back then it was the old Excel spreadsheets that, many, many years ago, they were different than they are now. And I just built a spreadsheet, and we began chopping off every debt that she had. We paid them all off over about a 2 or 3 year period.
so in your senior class, when they did the who's whatever, they voted you most dedicated. And I always thought that was pretty apropos for high school students who probably really didn't know how dedicated you are. But how has not having a father made you more dedicated and more of a hard worker and more do-it-yourself kind of person?
Well, not having a father and having a mother who was as incredible as my mother was, with all of her, things that she couldn't handle in her life. She's a neat lady. And what it did, it made me fiercely independent, and it made me determined to do things myself. First of all, necessity is the mother of invention. If you can't afford to do something, you have to figure out how to do it. Or you don't. You either live in the problem, or you live in the junk, or you let something fall apart around you, or you figure out how to do it, because you can't just pick up the phone and call a repairman.
Tell the story about your roof falling into your living room.
Came home one day from school. My mom would work, so I'd come home by myself. My brothers were older. By the time I'm in late junior high, early high school, my brother closest to me was gone out of the house for the most part. He'd come back and forth some, but it was mostly gone. And so anyway, I walked in, opened the door to our door, and our living room ceiling had completely fallen in. And we'd known for weeks and weeks. The roof had been leaking, water had gone into it. A huge 4x8 sheet of sheetrock had completely fallen out of the ceiling. So on the floor was busted sheetrock everywhere and wet insulation all over the place. And so for a while, for a week or two, obviously we cleaned that up. But you could just look up out of our living room into our attic. And that's what you saw for a while. And so I figured out how to re-roof a house.
So do you remember, did you ask some men in the church to help, or did
No,
you just
I didn't. And that's one thing too.
read it? You didn't read it online back then, but did you
I
just
had
go?
books now. To
You
this
researched.
Day, to this day, I had bought myself a set of Time Life. I don't even know where this came from. I have a set of Time Life How to Do It books, and I'm sure people have probably seen those advertised on television. And I had that set. I would all through my growing up years and early 20s, I would go to that little, it's like an encyclopedia of how to do things, and I would learn how to do stuff.
So one question I have, because we could go on and on about stories about how you lived on very fixed income and paycheck to paycheck, or had lights turned off or phones turned off, or
You tell me about my first car. You were there.
you brought your first car for $350.
$350.
A Ford Pinto, and it was
That had been long since quit
standard.
being made because of the problems with it.
It had a stick shift that if you shifted a little bit too awkwardly, you could pull it out of the floor and see the ground running underneath the car.
Yep. No heat, no air. Just
No heat, no air. And I dated you back then.
That's what I always say. I remind people when people say, "Why did you date it?" You have no excuse. You saw all this.
I saw it all. I saw the diamond in the rough. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about being frugal versus being very generous, because I think you're both. And I think you try to teach our boys. In fact, I've asked our boys, this was kind of like a trivia question about Dad. I said, what would y'all say is the most evident way that Dad has taught y'all, or give me a good example of how Dad has taught y'all to be frugal? And they got it. They got it. They said, we aren't supposed to get a soft drink or a drink when we go out to eat. We can only drink water. I think even John will look at you now and go, can I have a Sprite?
Yeah, and they do have Sprite quite often.
But
I think they don't.
You sit there and rattle. That's $3 a person times 5 of us. That's $18.
That's for a drink.
That's $18 extra just in drinks. So talk about frugal versus generous.
Yeah.
How you can be both,
Well, I laugh
or why
because
you're both.
when people hear frugal, what they think is a person who won't spend money. And if you know me at all, I know you do, that's not true at all. I'll spend all kind of money. We'll be very, very generous. What I don't look at it as a person who won't spend money versus a person who is wasteful. I look at it as wastefulness. I won't waste money. And the whole idea of the drink, is $2.50, so you can get a drink that costs 5 cents. That's a waste of money. But then I'll have my kids turn right around and buy other kids lunches constantly, which are far more expensive than the drink we just saved. But you have the ability to give and to help others if you on this hand don't sit around wasting money. So I'm very careful not to waste money. But we don't buy very expensive cars. I don't do all that because I see all that as a waste of money. But we spend a decent amount of money on our house and stuff. So it's just a priority thing. I'll put a priority on something that'll build wealth, and that will last. But if it won't build wealth and won't last, then it's wasteful. So that's where the frugality comes in. If I think something is wasteful, I don't want to waste money. I'm very glad to give it away.
So, on the same line of generosity, how has your life growing up and not having a father affected the way not only you raise your own sons, and what you think about with your own sons, and also how it affects your own ministry, where you see God using you?
I guess with my own sons, probably not having a father with me, for me, it made my whole life is a series of trial and error. Because if you have a father who's active in your house and all that at a young age, you're being taught how to do things. So instead of trial and error and failing and messing around with something and having to it took me growing up much longer to learn things because I was figuring it out myself. Because I had two things. One, no father, and two, that developed in me almost a desire, and I'm not saying this is a good thing necessarily, but to some way it developed in me. I don't ask for help. It's a determination that I will figure it out. So sometimes growing up, now I feel like I'm past that now, but I'm in my early 50s. But growing up, that meant everything was a development. because it was a process. It was a process of trial and error with me figuring it out. So with my boys, I'm very, very deliberate about teaching them, trying to structure things where they have to learn, but making them struggle.
You want them to, you tell them
Struggle
to figure it
bit,
out.
Yes.
Don't give up on the problem.
You do no good helping your children do everything. They have to figure it out on their own. Something simple today, we sent John, just very simple, we sent John out to get a cart because we were coming back from down on the coast. We needed a cart to move our stuff out of the hotel room. And John walks back in and said, there's not one down there. And I just looked at him and I said, then you go find one. It's just that simple, something that simple. And I wasn't being mean. I was just, in my mind, I was going, he needs to walk and continue moving around until he finds one, until you solve that problem.
So, can you, now that you've come through and you have sons of your own, do you think a father is important in God's structure? And if it is, which I know you do, how do you overcome it when you don't have a father?
I think a father
How do you
is
match that?
extremely important. The best thing I can point to is look at the decay in our culture. Our culture is falling apart. Our culture is decaying. We're having men who have no earthly idea what it is to be a man. They have no idea how to learn. They have no idea how to operate through morality, not morality, through character. You have a massive amount of our culture who has no idea. That's because you have such a huge amount that's going over our fathers. And so, yes, it is critical. And the best thing I can point to is the fact that without it, you see what it's done to our culture. So, no, it's very critical. But you can't snap your finger and put fathers in all these homes. So what do? It's like in my situation. Well, one, you have to be in the church. You have to be around examples of godly men. You just have to. What I mean by that now, you know me, don't make me, I'll get sick, all this touchy feely. I don't want a man to come ask me how I'm feeling. I didn't as a teenager, I didn't as a 20-year-old, I don't today. I'm not interested in.
It wasn't necessarily on purpose.
No,
it wasn't like
no.
your mom went and grabbed men.
Yeah, that's why a lot of times you see all these plans about having mentors, and we eat lunch once every 2 weeks, and I check in on how my mentee, is that the right word? Mm-hmm. How he's doing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that's bad. For me, I would reject that. I would not have liked that growing up. Well, I wouldn't like it today. And I didn't like, and I wouldn't have liked it.
But it came
up.
naturally for you.
For me, what I mean is seeing men in action through the church, watching them. Whether they were investing in my life through Sunday school or just hanging out with us on youth trips, or if it was just me watching a guy that I knew he's a father, and I love seeing him interact with these kids. I could just see what it was about. And so what I would say is if you don't have a father, find those people. I don't mean find them by having to say, I got to go eat lunch with them once a week and pour my house. I'm not saying that. I'm saying find godly men and watch. Just watch them. You'll learn so much about what it means to be a man.
So is that some of how it's affected? I mean, God is, you've coached 3 boys in baseball, and you've coached multiple smaller basketball leagues and soccer teams, and
yep.
With 3 boys, multiple teams throughout the years. You've had fatherless boys especially come across your path.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it, not on purpose, it just has happened, but how do you, what is it, does there something in your mind and that you on purpose recognize that and say, that's me?
Yeah, absolutely. Had one particular baseball, I don't want to use names or anything because these kids are all, some of them are still in school. Had one particular baseball player that just was having a hard time in a failure situation where the game wasn't going well, and he was sort of panicking and in my words, wimping out at the end. And I remember just pulling him aside, making sure everybody left. You don't address things like that in a group. You address things like that individually. And I just told him, I said, you may not realize how much your life is like mine, was like mine. And I said, you have to learn how to act like a man and to be a man, what it takes to be a strong man in a tough situation. Yeah, I had conversations like that quite a bit.
On that note, I want you to give advice. Actually, I was just thinking about this now. Not only to fatherless children, especially boys, because you were one, but also what advice do you have to the moms that are single moms, or the moms that are widows, maybe?
Okay, yeah, that's, and again, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so who knows what I'm saying, take it for what it's worth. A couple of things. The first thing I would say to the moms is do not try to be their dad. Don't. Because I remember my mom would tell you that there were times in her life where she felt like she needed to be, but she knew she couldn't be. So what she did is she made sure I was connected again at our church. So she